I welcome everybody, all the panelists, and let me introduce to you once again, as most of you may not have been able to hear me. We have Som Chatterjee, Head of Procurement and Logistics from ITC Foods. We have Nihat Maid, Global Procurement Head from Cipla. We have Puneet Jagatramka, Director Procurement and Aluminium Sector, Vedanta Limited. We have Bijoy Kumar from Zydus Cadila. We have Gordon Donovan, Intelligent Spend Evangelist, SAP, and myself. As we know very clearly that this particular pandemic has been a great challenge to the business and the humanity at large. What it started in China has almost gone all over the world. And if you really look at China, China has been supplying intermediate products to the rest of the world, whichever part of the world you see, except for some areas in Africa, some areas in Russia. China has been a major importer of this intermediate product, affecting supply chain. And as we have seen, there are so many disruptions that have happened in the world economy. After March 2011 earthquake and tsunami in Fukushima in Japan, I think a lot of companies were affected. And similar earthquakes, floods, tsunami has happened. But one of the fundamental impact of these floods or these earthquakes were that suddenly your supply source dries or is disrupted or is not visible, and procurement planning becomes a very difficult and a costly affair, and it disrupts business these things. So something which starts as a supply chain disruptions disrupts the whole economy as a whole. And in this pandemic, you can see clearly that when we look at the pandemic, confirmed cases today are 49,32,180 across world, and there's 3,23,136 deaths. And if you look at the map of the world, everything is red, orange, and some of them are green, but largely the whole world has been affected. 190 plus countries have been affected. Something which started as a supply shock in China today has become a demand shock. And what is also interesting to see is that this pandemic did not happen at one time. It has length, it has breadth, and it's so dynamic. It has moved in different countries with different pace, engulfing most countries, disrupting supply chains, procurements, and disrupting livelihood and then demand. In India, if you see, today there are 101,139 cases, and if you look at the deaths, it's around 3,163. The deaths as a percentage of the total cases of the density of the population is not so disturbing, but I think India has been under testing. And you see the map of India, you find that India has been affected from length to breadth and from east to west. And you see there are so many red zones that has emerged along with the yellow zones which are less affected. And I think luckily the rural India still is, not so affected, primarily because it's a green zone. But given the problems of the migrants that you see in India, if this hotspot increases and reaches villages, I think it could be a very dangerous thing. And hence, one of the major things that we really need to see is how do we look at this pandemic? What are the sources of problems in the supply chain? And one of the things that come to my mind is that, as I said earlier, after the March 2001 earthquake and tsunami in Fukushima, Japan, many multinationals learned painful lessons about the hidden weaknesses in their supply chain. Almost 9 years later, it seems the lesson of Fukushima must be learned anew, as many companies worldwide scramble to identify which of their invisible lower tier suppliers, those with they don't directly deal, are based in the affected regions of China. Supply chain management knows the risk of single sourcing, but they do it anyway in order to secure their supply or meet a cost target. This has been a major concern, and pandemic has exposed it. Often they have limited options to choose from, and you find that even the options to choose in such a situation lies in China. Risk management principle should be applied here. And I think I will leave it up to my esteemed panelists to tell us how do we go about looking at the risk from the supply source. How are we going to map the risk from the supply source, and what needs to be done while mapping the supply source is important. I think one or two pointers that I would say that, if you look at the overall supply chain network for the suppliers and for the procurement fraternity, you find that we need to evaluate first-tier supplier by using procurement performance indicators that capture their requirement for lower-tier supplier. And I think a lot of research that I have got my hands on says that we get struck somewhere at the first tier of the supplier, and we do not know the deep tier risk that lies within the supply chain. So I think one element of this would be that our panelists will explore this, and we will go ahead with this. Second is that if you look at this supply risk, how do you marry the supply risk to the demand risk? And if you look at the demand risk, and I come back to India for a simpler reason that it's easier for me to put it in context for the audience here, and you find that the way the red, the yellow, and the orange zones have emerged in India, and where the lockdown happened, it disrupted the whole supply chain, it disrupted whole business activity, it disrupted movements, and ultimately it impacted employment and livelihood, and hence it impacted the demand structure. I think no pandemic except for the swine flu that happened much earlier, you can see such a level of disruption. And if this is the level of disruption that we have, then how do you manage to, service customer in different zones? And I think we have seen in the first 2 months that companies have actually been very, very proactive, very, very agile, very, very dynamic to reach community level demand and plan daily rather than plan for a month or a plan for a quarter or plan for a week. And they have been planning and understanding the dynamics of change in such a small span of time. And one question would be that how useful can this data be to even plan the immediate 6 months or next 2 quarters? And how would the dynamics of this particular disease how do you understand this? And I think one of the major ways of going about here is that, can you build scenarios, worst case scenario, the most optimistic scenario, and the best case scenario, and plan respectively for them, and daily look at what scenarios emerges, you can take it there. I think it is very important for the firms to start looking at it, because it's not overhead. The spread could be, in India, for instance, spread could go to smaller tier 2, tier 3 cities. What's your strategy? As you see, there's a green zone and this is allowed now. And how do you source your supplies? And hence, the first fundamental question is that as you start looking at scenarios, how do you plan your supply chain? How do you plan your procurement? And in India, largely firms have been firefighting. I think they've survived the pandemic because of a huge inventory that lies into the supply chain, but their supply chain has been exposed. The vulnerability of the supply chain has been exposed when you operate in silos. And when you operate in silos, when you have supply risk, you have production risk, you have manpower risk, and I think that's going to be the biggest risk in India. How do you integrate them? And this is where I think there is a need for us to realize that, all the time we have been investing into technology, but technology sometimes has not been fruitfully used, and technology is not enabling the outcome of understanding and mapping the entire supply chain from the last mile customer to the deep tier supplier. And today there are sources of data and analytics, digital, organizational changes that are needed. We need to build new capabilities, create new governance structure by building new processes. And we need to build visibility across the supply chain. We need to find what are the alternative sources of supply, whether we need to move to other geographies, or you need to go local, as that's a big debate today, or we need to look at process automation and autonomy, digital supplier collaboration. I think we have not been collaborating. We have been more transactional. We need to be collaborative and relational, and we need to improve your margin, use cash flows, use financial collaboration with the deep tier, supplier who have been badly affected, manage this thing, and bring about an organizational change where your demand planning, your distribution planning, your production planning, your factory planning, your raw material and packaging planning, all are integrated through the bill of material, because we all know that if you break the bill of material, you get the bill of material, then you break those bill of materials, you get bill of material. But where are the sources? How do you build this bill of material based on immediate demand that's emerging because of the scenarios that you build? And how do you secure a supply by knowing that what are the bills of material that are required from tier 1? And how do you, know that tier 1 has a very strong understanding? Because Intel found during this particular earthquake that tier 5 or tier 4 supplier did not have the one basic, material that is needed to go into it, and it distorted the complete supply chain. So I think our take is this. I will now move to my panelists, and I will first go to Gordon, and I invite Mr. Gordon to take this panel discussion forward. Hi, Gordon. Welcome.
Hi, good afternoon. Good evening. How are you?
I'm fine. And, let's start with this. I gave you a brief understanding of mine about the pandemic and the larger supply chain and this thing. You have a global perspective among the panelists as you deal with multiple geographies. How do you see the pandemic vis-a-vis other natural disasters of the recent past? How is this crisis different? What has been the impact of this on the supply chain as well as procurement? Will businesses pay more attention to supply risk now?
Well, I certainly hope businesses will pay more attention to supply risk, supply chain risk, supplier risk. I was reviewing some research a few days ago, and it was quite startling. Some of the research that came out. It suggested that 21% of organizations have supply risk programs aimed at strategic suppliers. So that would mean that 79% of organizations don't have supply risk programs aimed at strategic suppliers. So, and I think when we come to ask the question, how do you see this pandemic against other disasters, is I don't think that organizations have been as prepared as previous disasters, either natural disasters that are occurring or other disasters that were kind of planned. How's it different? Well, I mean, and I don't think they were as prepared previously because, you mentioned globalization in your opening remarks. And I think that has almost been seen as a panacea. And I don't think there's anything wrong with globalization or global supply chains. I think that that generally that means that they find the most efficient way of doing something. If labor is a high cost, then global supply chains drive an efficiency in that. What it doesn't do is it doesn't drive resilience in supply chains particularly well, because that's not what its primary focus is. So right now, I think if we're thinking that resilience is something that we're looking at, and as I was mentioning, that 21% of procurement teams have strategic supply risk programs, and only I think 9% previous were focused on improving that. To answer your question around, do I think that risk business will pay more attention to supplier risk? I think so, based on that. And I think if we took those questions again in 6 months' time and in 9 months' time, then generally I think that number will increase. And I was talking to a colleague of mine, or sorry, a friend of mine, who actually runs. He actually used to run an outsourcing operation in India for Procurement, and he now runs a podcast called Art of Procurement, which I don't know if it's known, but he was saying to me that the ROI of a risk management program is only really there when you're in the middle of a risk event, because of course it's really all about preventing the risk from happening. So I look back at some of the things that I was involved with for Y2K, for instance. Now, a question that will drive you all mad is, if we didn't do all the work that we did in preparation for Y2K, would Y2K have still had? I'll summarize in terms of the impact. 4 main areas for me: financial stability, disruption and continuity management, how procurement has been agile in its responsiveness and how organizations have been agile, and workforce management. So I think we've seen financial impact in suppliers. I think in our supply chains, we need to be sure in procurement that those suppliers and supply chains will be intact in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. So in terms of some procurement planning pieces, understanding and gaining visibility into financial supply chain is pretty important. In terms of disruption management, I think that's meant that procurement has had to find and ramp up alternative sources of supply relatively quickly. And I took the chance to take a look at some of the Ariba stuff that we've been coming through, and top 5 commodity areas: medical, computer hardware, software and telecoms, laboratory equipment. The last 2 are quite interesting in terms of the activity and the impacted categories: construction, maintenance, security and defense services. Interesting in terms of those areas. So in terms of those disruption areas, that's key. Will supply chains become more localized? It's almost to go into your groups and discuss. I think it was happening anyway. I think that, you know, statistics were showing that supply chains were becoming more localized. What this will more than likely drive is a rapid localization. And I think this is where the risk management piece really is going to come to the fore, that just local sourcing and local supply chains is not the sole answer. That might be an answer. A friend of mine said, well, I've mitigated my risk for outsourced call centers. I've basically put them across 3 suppliers, but they were located next door to each other in a high climate issue area. Yeah, so if a flood comes, all 3 of your suppliers are knocked out. So not necessarily localization is going to resolve.
Right. Thank you, Gordon.
No worries.
Thank you. Back to you. Thank you for such a great insight and bringing the importance of supply chain finance. But before we get into those things, we will invite Nihar from Sydney. Som, let's start with you. You come from a food industry. This has been a very essential commodities during the lockdown. We have had, a lot of problems in the first phase, and then problems have been solved to a great extent. Can you tell us the kind of disruption that has happened in the food industry, both in terms of demand and supply, and how have you all managed it?
Right, Rakesh ji. So I represent ITC's food business, and We have some iconic Indian brands like Ashirwad Atta, Sunfeast, Bingo chips and noodles, Zippy noodles, etc. And as you very rightly said, whenever such a black swan event happen, there is panic amongst the consumers. And the first thing that they did was they attacked the shelves, and all essential food products and staples particularly, they just kind of vanished from the shelves. The 4-hour notice that was given to us by the government before the lockdown commenced was in fact too short a time for us to have done any kind of planning. But then as I was listening to Gordon, I was reminiscing about the kind of work that we've done within ITC Foods for the last 3 to 4 years. And preparation, and in fact, there was often we used to question ourselves that all of this time and money that we are investing in risk mitigation, supply mill risk mitigation, will it ever pay off? Or is just one of those fire drills that we keep doing every month? All of us, there's a siren, all of us run out of the office, and then we are told it's just a drill and then come back. But guess what? The Black Swan event happened, and when it did, we were ready. In fact, I'd like to share with you what happened. It was very early on in January when we picked up that basically we have this huge listening program, which is called Sixth Sense. Basically, we are connected to all the social media and other outposts through artificial intelligence. So we can pick up consumers, consumer trends, what is the dialogue happening between them. And we had picked up that some kind of disruption is going to happen. Hello, are you all with me?
Yeah, yes, go ahead.
Right. And that's what got us planning very early on in Jan. In fact, we quickly went through our single source list. And for the last 3 years, we've had this practice of analyzing the single vendor base list that we call it every quarter, every 3 months. And the teams, their KPIs actually are built around reducing and risk mitigation. So every quarter that we presented that list to the management committee, our task was to make it a shorter list. And so over the last 3 years, we put in a lot of activity, which is now paying off. Now, quickly, Rakeshji, to India is a large country, and we have a very diverse geography. We have ITC Foods is about 108 plants across India, and therefore it would be counterintuitive to have 1 or 2 large vendors. So most fortunately for us, most of our raw material is agri-based, and it is all mostly local, right? So that gave us a head start. Of course, having said that, we do use certain packaging substrates which are imported. We do use certain specialty ingredients and flavors which are imported. So back in January, when our listening posts picked up that there could be a problem going forward, we put a contingency plan in place, and we ramped up our inventories within the cold stores or warehouses with our domestic vendors where possible. So that was the one tactical thing. Now, since in the interest of time, I'd just like to break up this into 2. What we did at ITC Foods, one is the tactical bit, which I've been telling you about, and the other one is more of a strategic piece. Now, in strategy, and the first dialogue which comes to mind, I don't know if I can attribute it to Winston Churchill, but a lot of people do. And his famous words was, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." Right? So although this was a crisis, this is a disruption, but with it, it brings its own advantages. And for people like us who are into, who are into commodities and are linked to the international markets, such events can give you windfalls. For instance, how many of you have been tracking various commodities which have been really falling? They are at multi-year lows. When was the last time we had seen crude oil so low? Similarly, what follows crude oil very faithfully is crude palm oil, which we use a lot in our food products, and sugar ethanol, which again we use a lot. And we've seen a seminal drop in prices. So, it's an opportunity. We are trying to see how we can leverage and cover, hedge ourselves, and take advantage of these low prices. We do see these disruptions. We've seen these disruptions in the past. I mean, I'd just like to remind you, 3-4 years back, there was this Malaysian aircraft which went missing, MH370, if I remember the flight number correctly. And what happened? For 3 days, the Malaysian ringgit had completely collapsed. It had lost about 27% in its value. And that made suddenly palm oil importers like us in India, it made the commodity very extremely attractive. We went long almost 15 months at that point in time. So we have a mechanism in place where we can use these disruptions to our advantage. Whenever they do happen, we can jump in with alacrity and take advantage. So that is more of the strategic bit. In terms of use of technology, we've always been very well.
We'll come back to that on the technology.
Right.
Tom will come back to technology a little later.
All right.
All right. Thank you very much for bringing that local perspective of the food industry. I think we had Nihar here. Hi, Nihar. Can you hear us? Can you unmute yourself? And Nihar comes from Cipla, again, a essential commodity company. And India had allowed essential commodity, but they faced a lot of problems. As you've seen, problems are very well. You can have a summary of it. But what are the procurement planning paradigms which have emerged post-pandemic, Nihar?
Okay. Good afternoon and good morning and good evening, everyone, depending upon where you are logged in from. Initially, I had some technology issues logging in, but I think now we are there. I have overcome that and I'm in now. Am I audible, Rakesh?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So I would like to start from a quote which I have recently heard, and it goes like this: that when the caterpillar sees the end of the world, the master sees a butterfly, right? And that's exactly what is happening. That whether we want to be the caterpillar or the master, that's the choice is up to us. It is a horrible thing which has happened. Nevertheless, and especially from the space which I coming from, right? That we are all, I come from the pharma industry. I represent the pharma industry. I have one more colleague with me who is from the pharma, and we have a very big responsibility. And the implications are just not. Go from that side. The implications are not economic, right? The implications are far beyond that. If we are not able to keep our factories running, then it's going to be a big calamity, and there is a huge drug shortage possibility which may come up. So it's very much imperative for people like us to keep our factories running and keep serving the patients for which we all work for. Now the question is, how do we do that, right? That there is a huge lockdown which is global now. Worldwide, all the factories are shutting down, and there is no way to keep the factories running, because it's not only about keeping our factories running, but it's also about our ancillaries. And many a times, and especially during the initial phases of lockdown, the government did not recognize, and rightfully so, that a carton or a shipper manufacturer is an important part of the pharma value chain. And if he doesn't deliver a corrugated box on time, the supplies don't go, right? So there I would put it up in two phases: a little bit short term, wherein we have to manage the show and keep the factories running for the next 2, 3, 4 months till the time the lockdowns are on. And then I'll go to a little bit long-term perspective of what should be done and what all of us should be looking at, right? So in a short-term perspective, it's very important that we make our vendors work for what is needed, what we are working for, right? And as long as we are able to fulfill the demand and communicate the demand all the way down the supply chain to the last person in the of the chain, then we should be able to pass this phase and very efficiently. Now look, the companies are also not running at a full capacity, right? Most of the pharma companies now have been able to ramp up to something around 70, 80, 90%, right? If they are lucky, they would be running at 90%, but we are all running at 70, 80% capacities. There is a lot of rationalization of what products to serve and what not, which is happening. And hence, it is imperative to have a mechanism of full kitting, which flows all the way down to the last leg of the chain, and keep the suppliers running for what we want for the next 2-3 weeks, right? And while most of the companies who are engaged in manufacturing of drugs are running pretty much well, but the ancillaries are finding it really, really difficult, and most of the operations for the ancillaries are also largely manual. So it's imperative for us to be the bigger brother or elder partner in the chain and help them out. And in case we are able to do that, we will be doing good to them by keeping their factories running, and good to the patients by keeping the drug supplies on. So that is one. Number two, which I would like to touch upon, is how are we redefining or reimagining patient centricity in this whole thing, and patient is really at the center.
Okay, go ahead.
Right, patient is really at the center, right? And what is happening is that the drugs are becoming repurposed. You see hydroxychloroquine and the loperamide of the world being used for COVID, and by doing that, the original patients of these drugs, which are HIV and anti-infective patients, they are facing a huge shortage, right? And that puts an additional pressure on supply chain and procurement people to up the supplies and ensure that none of the patients get impacted by this. So really there is a need, and most of the pharma companies have started to rethink patient centricity, that there was never ever a scenario wherein one had to choose between an HIV patient or a COVID patient, and that's a terrible thing to do, right? But the reality is that we are all faced with this scenario. So that is one more aspect. And the last but not the least, with all the economic packages which are being announced by the government.
Nihar, I'll come back to you on that a little later when we look at restructuring and things. Let me go to Bijoy. Bijoy is from Jai. And Bijoy, I think Nihar brought about the demand side of it, the changing dynamics of patient centricity, and I think it's at times, shakes everybody when we see that, oh, COVID, what happens to the rest when we only look at COVID? And this kind of, the whole distortion in the demand pattern for and the treatment pattern has really created a very different kind of supply chain for all of you. How Zydus has managed one single source sourcing from China? What has been the overall supply chain logistics issues that have affected Zydus? As an example, if you could bring about the whole risks that has emanated, the whole constraints that have come up, and how have you all tackled those things?
Okay. Good afternoon. I think Nihar, as I think you would be much more aware of what we face because we are in the same industries. But yes, China is something which I have been working for the last maybe 15 to 20 years. I've been seeing it, and it's getting bad to worse. So what I feel and what I see is in the coming years is something what Gordon has said. Key localization, being self-reliant is going to be one of the key factors, basically. Yes, so for what Zydus has done, as you are seeing in the last 2-3 years, what we have been buying from China, it's been
going on for so many years, but every year there is some new issues which are normally coming. And if you see in the pharmaceutical industry, we are almost 60 to 70% are buying our inputs from China, which is a big one. If you see in the last 2 years, what we have been seeing in China, one, we had pollution issues where the factories got closed down, they were moving out their factories. The next year you had a blast coming in, and then again you had, so in Zydus, when we looked at it in the last 2-3 years, we had already made up a plan of what are the basic things what we have to do, and we started off this risk mitigation process in a long way, I think 2 years down the line. What has helped us is basically our basic, if you see our portfolio, we have moved out a lot of it from China, but again, in the more on the API industries where the intermediates, raw materials are basically sourced from China, the bigger segment comes over there. So there, yes, we had started, but it's such a big scale volume. And if you see the business, actually, if you see the business economics always held, where we always looked at low cost and very high scale manufacturing. That is where we had this, we had to go to China. So it was something which was, which we didn't want, but we had no options basically. So what this COVID has happened is we have looked at it in a big way, and this has helped us. I think both industries, and then we looked at our, I think this also, we have been actually trying to look at, we have been trying to build in local sources, we have tried to look at, and one of the basic cases that what Nihar had said, hydrochloroquine, when we are producing maybe around 3 tons, we started making around 11 tons, 15 tons, and this could be possible only when we tried to look at sourcing, making India. We had looked at Indian manufacturers, we went to them, we started giving them processes, we could help them in trying to build up their capacities, and that is what when we look at today's volume, that we are making around 11 tons, 15 tons, and going to 30 tons. So what, if you see in the case of Zydus, what we have done is we have looked at long-term back when we looked at China, and we felt there's going to be a big risk coming the coming years to come, and COVID has helped us in trying to mitigate the risk. But going forward, I think we as an industry and we in the government also, I think, should look forward that how do we really mitigate, and that's where I think the industry has to be united upon, and the government should support a lot on infrastructure, and I'm trying to see that we mitigate this risk.
All right, Bijwai, that's a good approach when you look at and you secure a supply and try to foresee the risk much before. And I think, let me go to Gordon, and how can we firm secure the supply base, build financial and social safety nets for the struggling partners, and what are the strategies that are needed in order to see that disruptions are taken care? Gordon.
I think when you're looking at disruptions and vulnerability, typically we look at planning and supplier networks, and that's a typical focus that we kind of need, we kind of do, which is great, and we absolutely should do. Demand planning, how complex or concentrated the supplier network is, how resilient is it to disruption. And I was listening to one of the panelists earlier saying how all of the things that we were doing from these scenario things took me back to the Y2K stuff. We drilled in the same way that you were mentioning around the fire drills. We drilled on supply chain disruption, so that we could identify what the potential things would be, so that we could put things in place, having generators nearby, increasing stock to give us an extra week of sourcing, those types of things. So typically the planning and the supplier network and measuring how exposed, and this is probably a broader thing outside of just COVID, but in terms of how exposed the network is to tariffs and other trade disruptions. We see a lot of trade disruptions going on right now, and that'll probably continue till, I guess, November to December. With we might see that change next year. But I think the fuller picture focus needs to start thinking about things like transportation and logistics. How resilient is the flow, the physical flow in the logistics world? One of the panelists was mentioning getting visibility into things and trying to get these early warning systems. one of the indices that I look at a lot from a logistics perspective is the Baltic Sea Index, the Baltic Dry Index. That tells me what the physical flow of goods are, and I can test my supply chain for those resiliency areas. So broadening out the picture from planning and supplier, transportation, logistics. I've mentioned financial resiliency. It is absolutely going to be imperative for us all to do more than just the typical financial checks and financial healthcare checks in our first tier supplies. We've got to start looking at the entire supply chain and thinking about what we do to help impact that financial supply chain. Listening to colleagues on the panel from pharma, and my background is healthcare and rail, so listening to the patient is at the center of everything that we do. That's word for word what the vision was of the last healthcare company that I worked for. The patient is at the center of everything that we do. From a procurement perspective, we used to say the patient is at the end of every decision that we make. So whatever decision we make, ultimately the patient gets affected, whether that be changing the menus, whether or not that be changing the tape that you put on to hold the cannula in place, all of that things, the patient is going to be affected. So thinking about the complexity of the product and the mix of the product is something that we need to think about as well, that possibly doesn't normally get focused on from a supply chain visibility. And then the last bit is to look internally. Organizational maturity. How mature is your organization? How mature is the industry that you're currently in to start thinking about this resiliency perspective? Because it's all well and good as procurement and supply chain leaders for us to say we want to do this risk management process. If your organization is not mature enough to receive that, then you're not going to get anywhere with it, and you need to take it down a level. So in terms of what those areas are, those are the sort of 5 dimensions that I would seek to look for to help us build greater resilience in our risk management programs.
Thank you, Gordon, and that's a good perspective. I think that open up a lot of help. I'll take the debate further to another this thing, and we will have to look at one of the another thing that has really been very, very, very centric to this COVID-19, and as some of you must have experienced, and it has not triggered in this. I did talk about the migrant labor, but it's just not about migrant labor. It's about the availability of the labor, the security of the labor, and putting people first. How are we going to make our supply chain and procurement system more secure by providing the people first framework? And I think there's a lot of being talked about it, but let me get Som Chatterjee from ITC to give a quick perspective on this. Som, are you there?
Yeah, hi Rakesh ji. That's a very, very interesting and important human dimension that you brought in. In fact, I did mention that the lockdown gave us only 4 hours of advance notice, right? And on the first day of the lockdown, everything had shut down, and the administration in all the states were awaiting orders from the Ministry of Home Affairs, and that came across in a couple of days, and then we had to first of all prepare ourselves. So our CEO kind of literally pulled us up with our bootstraps and said, guys, we have to get on with life. We have to produce food products and get them to our consumers. I mean, after pharma, I mean, that is critical, but I think after medicines, you also need food, or sometimes you need to eat the food before the medicine. I don't know. Right. So we had to do that. And a lot of fear is what we encountered, Rakesh ji. There was the fear of the unknown. And for us to be able to get all our 108 plants up and running within the first 3 to 4 days of the lockdown was very interesting exercise in human resources. So we had to basically lead from the front. Our local managers, plant managers, they kept going to the plant. They kept talking to the labor, kept telling them that right now, even if you want to go back to your villages, what is it that awaits you? You don't have trains, you don't have means of transportation, so you are safer over here. Overnight, we made arrangements for collapsible beds, tents, meals, so that we actually, we were told by the authorities at that point of time that you could only work with 1/3 of your usual strength, and that also if they stay in situ in the location, which we quickly ramped up. Of course, IDC's policies of going of high degree of automation in the plants really made sense today. But yes, it was a very challenging period for us. It continues to be challenging. In fact, at that point of time, there were no means for these laborers to get back to their villages. Now the government has opened up the railways and the busways, so we are seeing a mass migration of people.
And that is a big challenge for the risk of getting the workmen and manpower for the industry in the future. I think, Nihar, I'll come back to you quickly on this also. What are you seeing as a people first policy post-COVID? Because what Som has said is, the dilemmas of human suffering. But what do you see as a response from the organization in terms of creating a more sustainable, resilient organization towards securing labor and manpower?
So thank you, Rakesh. And first of all, I would like to commend Som and team ITC for managing 160 locations, if that's what I heard. And that's a commendable thing. Cipla has 37 and we had our time. So I could imagine how would it be to, manage 160 odd locations, keeping all the social distancing norms intact. As they say that charity begins at home, right? So it cannot be that when we serve millions of patients across the world, we don't have an appreciation of our own employees, right? So it goes without saying that the safety and security of our own employees and our partners is paramount, and that is the first thing to be taken care of, right? And there is no compromise in that. So initially, for a couple of weeks, all of us took some time to first understand that how the spread is happening and what all is needed, which is prescribed by the government or even over and beyond that to ensure a safe working environment. And this is not only at our own Cipla locations, but across our partner locations also. There was so much of anxiety, and the first couple of weeks went in understanding ourselves of what is to be done, erring on the side of caution. It is okay to overdo a little bit so that the people are safe, and then convincing people that okay guys, please come to work, you are safe here. And now what stories we are hearing is that our units are up and running at 90%, almost 90% capacity, when people really feel safe in the way they commute, the way they come for work. And some of them even feel safer at work than home, because everyone is not living in the same situation, right? Now having said this, right, it is also important to get a output out of the whatever people who are coming, right? And that will mean that the repurposed strength is the 100% capacity, right? Though what used to be considered as 100% capacity, the normal changed, and there are several productivity measures which were required for us to deploy, not only within our units but also at our contract manufacturers or our suppliers units, to see that the output is not compromised by the lower number of people which are turning up for work. And that has become the new normal now, and look at the whole redefining of the productivity matrix which has happened. So
right. I think business disruptions as of now has been very clearly seen from the human angle, and you will see a lot of changes in check on the physical, mental and emotional health of the core team, locating the industry near cities or states which have larger manpower, maybe, and this will discongest the whole cities, and maybe new pattern of industrialization may take place. You need to have social distancing. You need to have places to stay. And I think these are, for the first time in the history of capitalism, that such kind of measures will come to the downtrodden workers at the end of this thing. Because we are running over time, I will come back to one question and take some of the essential questions on localization later into the question answer session, as I have a lot of questions on that. So I'll go back to Gordon here. And Gordon, since few decades, and lastly in this decade, we have been talking about digital technology, panacea to all else. We thought that the technology is going to be supporting the supply chain decision making. I even heard what Harvard Business School professor write and speak on saying how supply chain will be there. There will be vertical tower, everything will be visible, and hence the supply chain function will become so linear. This pandemic has been a very, very different storytelling exercise for all of us. But nonetheless, how can we leverage the available technology in order to bring about a huge amount of visibility, risk management policies, resilience framework, from deterministic to resilience framework in our businesses using the modern technology? And you are at the forefront of using that, so I thought I'll hear it from you first.
Okay. So, look, managing uncertainty requires, and therefore managing risk, requires a quick and accurate assessment of what's going on and a plan to respond. There's a need to bring clarity to the condition of the supply chain to deliver the reliability and the resilience that's needed. For me, it starts with listening and listening to the supply chain. So using technology to increase the visibility into what's going on into that supply chain through supply chain analysis, but also getting direct insight from the suppliers into their situation. So really figuring out and getting those early warning systems that one of my colleagues mentioned earlier into the integrity of their timelines and to their commitments. We then can use technology to dig deeper into your own data, to look at the location, to look at commodities, purchase orders, all of that operational data that you need to really assess current suppliers, evaluate the reliability, and to identify what the future risks might be. And finally, the need to identify alternative sources and the options to fill those, the options that need to be filled, those gaps that need to be filled, to adapt and adjust to market demands and turn uncertainty into more stability. So what I think that means, look, in the short term, I think companies are concerned and organizations are concerned about shortages of goods, and as we've heard, shortages of supply of people and services, very, very, very critical. Long term, I think businesses, as we emerge, are going to have a renewed focus on better quantifying risks, and quantifying risks with a mindset to buying insurance, not necessarily physical insurance, as in insurance policies, but using an approach for the mapped probability. So if we think back to this ISO 31000 is the risk management framework, we can use technology to both put the context, look at the likelihood, and then the probability of something happening. Using this discrete event simulation that we've seen previously, and one of my colleagues mentioned earlier, around this event simulation, and I think fundamentally redesign business cases to include losses from a lack of resiliency, i.e. this what if scenario analysis, and that includes, if we don't do this, then what is the potential loss? I think that's how we could start to drive and utilize the digital technologies to help do that. So increasing visibility, gaining deeper insights into our supply chain partners, and not just in the first tier supply chain, but looking beyond those suppliers and mapping all of these things out. Driving a responsiveness. So So the agility and you know we've seen lots of stories, and one was mentioned around the speed of being able to find a new supplier. Clearly, once you get these early warning systems, agility and responsiveness. Agility comes from technology. Yeah, the ability to ramp up automation and digital tools allows us to be more responsive and agile in what we're doing. Things as simple as electronic signatures. You know, I work for an organization that has not now, but previously, that had signing ceremonies where it was signed every second week on a Tuesday at 3 o'clock. And that was the only time that contracts could be signed. Try doing that now. And what that's going to do is, it's simple things like that. And I went back earlier and mentioned organizational maturity. That's the first step for lots of organizations from an automation maturity, is things like electronic signatures. So mapping that technology roadmap to your organizational maturity will also be something that is key.
All right. Thank you, Gordon. That's a good perspective, and technology definitely will drive that. I think there's a lot of studies which says that within this 50 days of lockdown in India, companies which were more technology friendly have actually been able to manage the risk much better. These are done by academic institutions, so one can actually look at the question there. But I'll move to Bijoy on the same question. From a user's perspective, what role do you think can technology and digitalization and data analytics play? I think let's go progressive over Gordon rather than repeat the same thing, so that we use the time well.
Yeah, I think I'll take it forward from Gordon only. I think what he was saying on the maybe digital signatures is basically, if you see on the procurement angles or maybe on the cycle of procurement, there are a lot of tools currently which are there, which is going from a direct procurement till the billing section. So yes, there is a possibilities, and a lot of people are still using it. Maybe you can maybe the basic input raw materials are not there, but there are a lot of commodities, consumable, where you can use this tools and basically try to avoid a lot of maybe interactions, a lot of communications which are possible. And there are possible a lot of 2 or 3 tools which are very good in the sphere of technology. Yes, in these tools also there is again the possibilities, and where do you actually look at doing digitalization? Either you can do on a selective technology, trying to be more intervening on addressing more of inefficiencies, or maybe going full-fledged on a complete overtake of system and processes. And it depends upon the industry, basically how, where, how much of use you can use it. But yes, as of today, with this situation, the companies, the industries have to look at more on technology. And if you see, there are a lot of things happening in India because of that. If you see a lot of clearances having just as easily on scan, DO, not actually people running around with the original DOs and trying to get their consignments cleared. A lot of things, a lot of bureaucracy has changed. In terms of procurements, in terms of our supply chain, you see billings and payments. Billings are being done on digital payment, digital invoices. Payments are done on RTGS. A lot of things have already changed basically. But yes, there are possibilities. There are huge ways and means where we can try to build in this technology. But as I told you, it depends upon industry-wise and the products what you select.
Thank you, Bijoy, and I'll take Som into the question. Som, you deal with a highly complex local supply chain for food and agri. How have you been able to use the technology? A quick reply, Somji, will be good for us.
All right. So what we've deployed now is what we call a new platform called Varadi. Okay. It's a very simple app which works on GPS, and through it we communicate with our wide range of vendors. We communicate our requirements to them. They send their quotations back. We accord business, everything through really a very small 12 GB download. And today most people or most truck drivers carry smartphones, and therefore this has been something which we had in the works for a long time, but we accelerated and we put this into use during this crisis, and believe me, it's really working miracles for us.
Thank you.
So that was a
I
short
think
answer
that,
you wanted.
yeah, that's a quick one, and I think that's very useful. I'll go back to Nihar and raise one fundamental question which everybody would be facing in their organization. And that is that all these problems, including the use of technology as an enabler in creating a huge competitive edge for procurement, how do you see today the role of procurement within an organization, and how do you make procurement a very strong strategy tool? Procurement as a strategy, how do you go ahead with it?
Thank you,
What are the
Rakesh. Thank you, Rakesh. And I'll go a step back and go to the point which I was making earlier of the tremendous amount of economic packages that the government is releasing, right? And that certainly there would be a lot of localization drive and opportunities coming out of that. Nevertheless, even without that, there is a lot which will be a little bit far-fetched, right? That it will still take some time for the industry to shift, and even over time also we will completely not be able to shift beyond geographic boundaries. We will still have to source certain material from China, Europe, US, all across, and it's a global economy.
Nihar, my question was a little different.
Coming to that. Yeah.
Okay, I'm looking at organizational enablers, which will help technology to be accumulated, which will help procurement to be seen in a visible way. What are that is required for your organization?
Of course, I'm coming to that. So in the short term, while this would be a long-term one, in the short term, there would be a lot of partnerships which we will see, because fundamentally in India, we have excess capacities in one pocket, and we are struggling for capacities in the other pocket. So you will see a lot of uncanny partnerships happening. Visibly, people who are competing with each other will come together for a collaborative growth. Second thing, on the technology front, I would like to go beyond this, beyond the electronic and the collaborative tools that we are using. See, for pharma, for ages, we are manufacturing drugs in reactors and fermenters, right? It's time for all of us to move on. There are newer technology frontiers which are available. Technologies like FlowChem can achieve the same amount of drug manufacturing in 1/10 of a space, which we use when we do it through reactors. So, and the government packages which are being released, I'm sure would promote more and more use of newer technologies which come with a much lesser carbon footprint, and companies is this would really be on top. The investments which are till now, the investments which are required in embracing these technologies are phenomenally high, and so with the packages coming in, I think these technologies should be made very much within the reach of Indian and with that, I think we will see a new technological interventions in the pharma manufacturing space coming up. This is beyond the automations or the office collaboration tools that we are talking about. Thank you, Raj.